I now welcome in person and via video conference representatives from the Australian Services Union who are here in person, and the Australian Council of Trade Unions by video conference. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Erin Keogh, Assistant Director of Campaigns for the Australian Council of Trade Unions.
Thank you.
Natalie Lang, Branch Secretary of the Australian Services Union, New South Wales and ACT Services Branch.
Thank you.
Samantha Parker, Organiser at the Australian Services Union, New South Wales ACT Branch.
Good, thanks very much. I now invite you each to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the committee for providing us with the opportunity to appear today. The ACTU and the union movement more broadly is deeply proud and honoured to support the introduction of the Paid Family and Domestic Violence Leave Bill. Family and domestic violence is a crisis affecting all Australians. A staggering 3.4 million people have experienced violence at the hands of a family member or partner since the age of 15. And tragically, one woman is killed each week by a current or former partner. This bill will allow workers affected by family and domestic violence to no longer have to choose between their safety and their livelihoods. The entitlement will remove a significant barrier to those workers being able to access services, get medical or legal assistance, and in some cases, escape the violent relationship itself. The union movement has been fighting for this life-saving entitlement for over a decade. Unions, in particular the ASU and others, have spent a decade campaigning for and winning family and domestic violence leave through enterprise agreements. That hard work of union members has seen significant results. The first ever paid family and domestic violence leave was introduced in an enterprise agreement by workers and the ASU in the Surf Coast Shire in 2010. And since that time, the number of enterprise agreements, including paid family and domestic violence leave, has grown considerably. There are now 6,000 employers, including state and territory governments, who provide this right to over 1.2 million workers through those Union 1 collective agreements. But too many workers are still missing out on this crucial entitlement. And it's for that reason that the union movement has campaigned for universal access to paid family and domestic violence leave. The union members who provide the frontline services for those experiencing FDV, like FDB support workers, paramedics, nurses and teachers, all know the significant financial resources, time and workplace supports needed to escape or be safe from FDV. These union members also, unfortunately, know too well how many victim survivors, primarily women, are not able to access those supports at the moment without putting their jobs at risk or risking big, significant gaps in their take-home pay. And it's for that reason that this bill is so crucial. We've seen paid FDV leave operating in enterprise agreements very successfully for over a decade, and we know what a difference that makes. But it cannot be that only 1.2 million workers out of the 11 million Australians have access to this life-saving right. It must be universal. And it's for that reason we encourage the committees to support the passing of the bill. I'll now pass over to the ASU.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. My name is Natalie Lang and I'm the Branch Secretary of the Australian Services Union in New South Wales and the ACT. We represent workers employed by small and large businesses, multinational corporations and also sole traders working in the industries of airlines, shipping, travel and information technology, in water and transport utilities and social, community and disability services, delivering essential frontline services on behalf of local, state and federal governments. Of relevance to this inquiry, we represent workers and service providers in child protection, women's and family violence and prevention services. Since 2010, we've had a proud and successful history of working with workers, managers and employers to incorporate paid family and domestic violence leave entitlements and related supports in workplaces across all industries. And I would note that some of the supports that we have developed have actually been the recipients of Safe Work New South Wales Award for the support for workplaces to be able to implement these provisions and respond appropriately. In 2015, our Women's Services Subdivision formed the We Won't Wait campaign to call for the inclusion of 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave in the National Employment Standards as a universal entitlement. This is because, as frontline family violence practitioners, workers like Samantha saw firsthand the difference that access to paid family leave entitlement had on the journey that women, children and men that they support. Family violence is a complex issue, and the system and services that those experiencing family violence must navigate is equally complex. Our members found that it takes on average $18,000 and 141 hours to safely leave violence. This is why access to at least 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave is so essential. A worker's right to safety cannot be dependent on who her employer is. I'm joined today by Ms Samantha Parker, organiser, who has over 20 years' experience working directly as a frontline women's service worker.
Thank you. I have worked in the community services sector for over 20 years and have spent most of that time supporting women who have experienced domestic and family violence. I spent the last 8 years working in the sector as a court advocacy worker, supporting women attending court for domestic violence matters. I've worked with women who have had access to domestic and family violence leave, who have been able to flee their homes immediately and seek safety at a women's refuge knowing their job is safe. I've also worked with women who have lost their jobs because of domestic violence. One of these women had worked for her employer for over 20 years. She had won awards as a salesperson and she loved her work. She found herself in a relationship that was abusive and sought assistance from police. She had an AVO for her protection, but her ex-partner went to her workplace anyway in breach of that order and chased her through the store. Her employer rang her the next day and told her she no longer had a job because her personal life had interfered with her work life. It is my considered opinion this would not have been the outcome if she had had access to paid domestic and family violence leave. Paid domestic and family violence leave allows women the opportunity to leave abusive relationships safely. Thank you.
We strongly support the tabled legislation being passed in its entirety. Of particular importance are the following elements: that the quantum is 10 days, that part-time workers receive the full quantum entitlement, the leave entitlement is paid for casual workers, the rate of pay is the actual expected earning of the worker for that period, and that the entitlement is available upfront for all workers and not accrued progressively. It is essential that all of these elements are included in the legislation for the legislation to achieve the goal of ensuring that workers experiencing family and domestic violence can connect with services such as those provided by Sam and her colleagues. We thank you for the opportunity to address the inquiry today and we welcome any questions.
Good, thank you. Senator Waters.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you so very much to the ASU and the ACTU, not just for being here for today, but for the work that you've done to lead to this outcome. And full disclosure, I'm a proud, long ASU member, obviously the Queensland Division. I'm interested, in fact, it was the Australian Council of ACI, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, who made an interesting reference to the fact that frontline services also needed to be part of the story, and that family and domestic violence leave was not enough on its own. I strongly agree with that, and Ms Parker, thank you for your work that you've done over decades to support women fleeing violence. I'm interested in whether or not either of the unions will now join the campaign for increased funding for frontline services doing family and domestic violence support and prevention work. Is that going to become part of the campaign, and should that be something that the government funds in upcoming budgets?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Senator. We are actively campaigning all the time for increased funding to women's services. Unfortunately, we do still have a situation where far too often women seeking the support of women's services are turned away because they're at capacity. There are a number of issues with that. Absolutely, one of those is about the quantum of funding in a stable, long-term way that is provided to frontline services. We are strongly of the view that these services should be provided by feminist-led organisations, non-government organisations, where their ability to advocate not just for individuals but for systemic change and policy reform, is protected and indeed supported and part of what is funded to be undertaken by those organisations. That being said, it is those very workers who started the We Won't Wait campaign for 10 days paid family violence leave because, and indeed it was Samantha, who was the chair of the Women's Services subdivision at the time, who commenced those calls, based on their experience of seeing women who had been able to connect with women's services. Perhaps it was the Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service or with the local domestic violence service to be able to undertake safety planning, which is a time-consuming and essential undertaking for women to be able to leave violence, because as we know, often it is at the time of leaving violence that is the most dangerous time for the woman who is experiencing, as a victim survivor, that violence. Unfortunately, we do see far too often women who are connected with services becoming disconnected from those services and unable to continue through with the supports that are available because of not having paid leave from their work. We have seen circumstances where women have been in the safe room at the courthouse being supported by Samantha and her colleagues, and they have their employer on the phone telling them they've exhausted their leave entitlements and they need to return to work or they won't have a job. These are not hypothetical situations. These are lived experience that led to the ASU Women's Services subdivision commencing the calls for this to be a universal legislated entitlement, because we have seen that where workers do have access to paid family and domestic violence leave, they are more able to engage with services and take part in those undertakings, including refuge accommodation and safety planning. When they don't have paid leave, they often can't attend those appointments, make safe arrangements for children, and also non-attendance at work, where that causes a disruption to the income. And when I say disruption, I don't just mean not having an income. I mean an income that is not consistent with what they would have received had they been at work. Can actually be a red flag to the perpetrator, because we know that those experiencing family violence are also often experiencing many forms of family violence, not just physical violence, which can include financial control and monitoring. And where the perpetrator sees a disruption in the victim survivor's bank account, which is not consistent with the earnings that the perpetrator was expecting their partner to have, that can be a red flag to the perpetrator that the woman is perhaps engaging with services, accessing leave, preparing to leave violence, or even worse, we have had circumstances where that has prompted the perpetrator to believe that their partner may be having an affair. I believe you were at work. Why are your earnings interrupted? Who are you seeing? Who is he? And that can lead to massive escalations of the violence, even domestic homicide, and also put workplaces at risk, because as Samantha has recalled, we have had circumstances where the perpetrator has then assumed that it's occurring at work and has gone to the workplace, putting all those other workers at risk.
Indeed, and it's often the woman that then bears the consequences of that, both in the workplace and the non-work environment. Can I come to some features of the bill that the ACTU proposed that the Fair Work Commission didn't adopt, but this bill nonetheless, with great pleasure, includes? And I mean by that the application to casuals, the broader definition of family and domestic violence, and the removal of the need to accrue time before the entitlement becomes available to you. Perhaps Ms. Erin, sorry, what's your last name? Ms. Keogh, you could talk to why those provisions belong in the bill and should stay there.
I think firstly, it's worth recognising that there are significant improvements in the bill from what was provisionally proposed by the Fair Work Commission, and that's reflective of the broader mandate of Parliament to provide more broad-reaching and extensive solutions to what is a deeply rooted and complex problem in our system. In relation to the particular points you've raised, just starting off with casuals, for example, it's worth noting that the Fair Work Commission decision did not directly oppose the inclusion of casuals in the entitlement. It instead outlined a series of concerns about the complexity for determining how the entitlement would apply to casuals. We say the bill has resolved that very clearly with a simple and clear methodology for the calculation of the casual entitlement. So we would say there's no direct conflict. But another important point that I'll hand over to the ASU to expand on in relation to casuals is that casual employees are often the most vulnerable category of employees. They are on lower incomes, they have insecure hours, and they are more predominantly women. And so this is a category of employee who is perhaps in some of the starkest need of that support service. So just one example of the departure from the Fair Work Commission is that matter, and I'll hand over to the ASU for anything supplementary.
Thank you, Erin. I'd also like to add that of particular importance to us is that the full quantum is available to part-timers and there is a paid entitlement for casual workers. Firstly, we have never seen a circumstance where a perpetrator of violence has prorated the amount of violence that they inflict on their partner based on how many hours she works. We know that women experiencing family violence are disproportionately employed in insecure work, such as part-time work or casual work. And that's often a direct result of the violence that they have been experiencing that may have been escalating over the course of the relationship. So due to injuries, often if the perpetrator inflicts an injury that may be visible on the face or the neck, then the victim survivor will take time off work because they'll be trying to hide those injuries. Where there is a risk to the safety of children, and we gave some evidence about this in our submission to the inquiry, often the victim survivor will be taking time off work to be able to ensure the safety and care of their children. So we see that there's a pattern of disruption in work history that can occur for those who are experiencing domestic and family violence, which leads them to often be disproportionately employed in insecure work and therefore also in the most vulnerable category in terms of having financial independence and security. I think it's also worth noting that often for those who are experiencing family violence, the workplace is one of the only places that they do feel safe and respected, and it can also often be one of the only places that they're able to make access with services, where they have access to a telephone or a computer that's not being monitored by the perpetrator to be able to reach out and connect with services. So cutting off their ability to be at work in a paid way can actually really impede their ability to connect with services and to make a safe escape or passage.
Thank you. Just a couple of extra quick questions before I run out of time.
A quick question, Senator Waters, but yes, go ahead.
All right. I'll put some others in on notice. Does the union, either of you, have a view on perpetrators being eligible for the leave provision, to attend behaviour change programs or parenting programs or what have you, and whether or not any restrictions should apply to that eligibility, like a proof of not breaching a DVO or any other sorts of potential restrictions?
I would say that in its current format, the bill is intentionally designed to provide support services to those people who are the victim survivors of family and domestic violence, very intentionally. As the ASU have said, what this bill does is twofold. Number one, it provides the mechanism for those people to access the supports and services that will be so crucial to their safety or escaping the violent situation. But secondly, what it does is allow for continuity of employment, which research has shown can directly reduce the recurrence rate of family and domestic violence. Where a woman has confidence that there is a job to return to that will provide ongoing secure work and she has options that are provided by that ongoing secured employment, it will reduce the rate of recurrence of family and domestic violence for that woman. If the ASU has anything to add though.
Yeah, being able to demonstrate the security of your employment, I mean, anyone in the room who's had to fill out a rental application and you're asked to provide pay slips and bank statements are evidence that you have an ongoing income, it is often those undertakings that we can overlook that are so essential for women to be able to say, I do have job security, I'm accessing my leave, I know that I have my job to go back to after my leave, and I can demonstrate that I have employment so that I can get a rental property, so that I can physically leave the violence. I'd also suggest that my members often report to me that after the victim survivor has left the violent relationship, that the perpetrator of violence will use other mechanisms to drag out the control that they exert over the victim survivor. So that can be dragging out court appearances and court hearings. And so really the bill as it's proposed, I think appropriately ensures that there is adequate time for victim survivors to be able to connect with those services and undertakings.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Wards. Senator Payman.
Thank you, Chair. My question is around the evidence that suggests that some employees may be too afraid or too ashamed to come forward and seek paid family domestic violence leave. What is your experience of that in workplaces?
Just to start us off, I think it's really important to highlight the degree to which FDV leave arrangements have already been successfully adopted across the country. As I said, we have over 6,000 employers who've adopted paid FDV leave entitlement, including large employers like state governments. And that covers already approximately 1.2 million workers, and those arrangements have been successful. But what we would also say is that there is a real need for the Commonwealth Government to provide an education and training campaign that is designed and implemented with employer representatives and the trade union movement's engagement to ensure that the education and training that will give people confidence about accessing these entitlements is very comprehensive. But I'll hand over to the ASU if they've got anything to add to that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. It's hard jumping between screens and in real life, but it's exciting to be in real life. Certainly we do see quite often those who are experiencing family violence will access other leave entitlements prior to requesting access to paid family and domestic violence leave, but it's really important that they aren't required to access other leave entitlements prior to accessing paid family and domestic violence leave. And that's because of often the escalating nature of family violence. So what might start with a medical appointment where appropriately somebody would be accessing sick leave or accessing carers leave to care for a child, the violence can escalate. And then when we get to the point where we're making safety plans for the safe ability to leave violence and to connect with services, that's often when those who are living with violence will start to access paid family and domestic violence leave. One of the things, though, that we're really excited about around this bill and the possibility here is about the social change, though, that will come in workplaces. Workplaces are a fundamental influencer of community attitudes to so many things. It is, as we said, often the only place that somebody living with violence feels safe and feels respected. We reinforce that message as we have better communication and awareness about the paid family and domestic violence leave entitlement. We legitimise the experience. Often the most important way in which we have a trauma-informed response is to give the message that we believe you. And having paid family and domestic violence leave as a right, as an entitlement, says, we believe you. We know that this is an issue and you are safe and you are valued and you are supported. We also know that perpetrators are in workplaces. So this is an important primary prevention mechanism whereby workplaces get to make it very clear that we don't support domestic violence, that we don't condone domestic violence and we don't condone disrespect. So I don't think we can understate the important societal change that will come about this. We know unequivocally family and domestic violence is a workplace issue. It does spill into workplaces. When a woman leaves violence, often the perpetrator will know the only place that they can locate her, if she has access to refuge, for example, will be at the workplace, and they will turn up at the workplace, and the violence will spill into the workplace. And the financial monitoring and the threats and the intimidation and the stalking can spill into the workplace. We must have a workplace response.
Absolutely. Just Sorry, go for it.
I just wanted to quickly add to my experience has been that women who do have access to paid domestic and family violence leave feel safer talking to their employer. The fact that the leave is there means that they know that it is safe for them to disclose, and that that the responses they get are appropriate. It's a terrible thing for a woman to disclose that she's experienced violence and then she's not believed, or whoever's received that disclosure doesn't know how to respond. And by having the leave there, employers are already informed to a degree that people might talk to them about this violence.
That's a great segue to my quick follow-up question. So what are some practical steps that employees can take to encourage people to access family domestic violence leave to ensure that they've got, their privacy intact and that confidentiality, but also providing a safe and supportive environment?
Firstly, I'd like to note that there are already some really fantastic resources that are widely available to inform employers and to inform workplaces, to inform managers and also inform union delegates. So first off, the Human Rights Commission does have some resources available about confidentiality, about how you use the opportunities for primary prevention discussion, including information in induction of all new employees, and training and awareness mechanisms. So the Human Rights Commission's resources, I think, are really a great starting place. Safe Work Australia also has a fact sheet on responding to family and domestic violence as a workplace issue, which I think is another fantastic resource. The Fair Work Ombudsman has resources available. Also, the Australian Services Union, we're uniquely placed as a union, which means industrial relations is our area of expertise, but we're the Women's Services Union. And so our members as frontline family violence practitioners collaborated. It's culturally aware resources that we have developed because, of course, we represent very diverse services. And we've developed 2 resources that are widely available and freely available to any employers who would like to access them, or managers or workers or delegates. The first is a kit on a workplace guide to preventing and responding to domestic violence. So it talks about issues about maintaining confidentiality, how to do that, simply how to make sure that you have safe and appropriate information to provide in the event of a disclosure in the workplace. We also had developed during the COVID lockdown, and we grappled with work from home being a far more dominant feature of many workers' experience, that we did see increases reported from frontline services of escalating violence or increased instances of violence for women who were working from home with the perpetrator. And also, how then does an employer appropriately identify and respond where their employee might be being subjected to family violence in the home in a work from home situation. So we developed the Working from Home Isn't Safe When Home Isn't Safe guide, and I would commend this. I'm happy to hand it up to the committee as documentation if it may assist the committee's deliberations. I would note though that this resource has been widely applauded as being quite expert, very easy to interact with. It was actually launched by the New South Wales Attorney General, and it is the recipient of the Safe Work New South Wales Award. So we're very happy to make those available to the committee, and we think that there are very considerable resources. I'd also add that often when somebody who's experiencing family violence makes a disclosure, that might be the only time that they make a disclosure. And I know that this happens at workplaces because I'm a union official who was always in workplaces. And I have had the example where I went to a workplace, I talked about domestic and family violence leave, the campaign, and at the end of my presentation, a worker came up to me and said, I have been living with violence for 10 years and the perpetrator drops me off at work every day and picks me up every day. I have never had access to this conversation. And we were able to immediately step into a corridor, make contact with the women's service and put a plan in place. So this is a fantastic opportunity to be connecting victim survivors with services to be able to make those safety plans for them and for their children.
Thank you.
Good, thanks very much. Senator O'Sullivan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your time and your submissions, and I acknowledge the important work that you do in supporting victim survivors. Now, you do state that, rightly, very rightly, that no worker should be forced to choose between the safety of themselves and their children or their job. Can you help us. This provision that this bill provides obviously supports those that are employed within a business. What about those that employ themselves, sole traders?
So we actually represent hundreds of sole traders, my branch of the union, particularly those working in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, where that's becoming a more dominant feature of the workforce. And I have actually had discussion with some of our members working as sole traders. So sole traders already account for their own superannuation and other leave entitlements. So being able to factor that into how they do their work, that's a good thing. I'd also note that sole traders have much greater flexibility about how they access their own leave and how they record that. The great thing about paid family and domestic violence leave is it's available should you wish to take it up. But it's not like it's a requirement that if you're experiencing family and domestic violence and you want to suddenly access a apprehended violence order or a domestic violence order, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, it has a different name. It's not like you're suddenly ineligible to access a protection order because you haven't been using your paid family and domestic violence leave. So it is at the discretion of the worker, whether that worker is an employee or a sole trader, as to whether they will access this leave entitlement. But just like sole traders account for other leave entitlements and their own superannuation, they have the ability to do that.
And if I can just supplement that by just confirming the one of the intentions of this bill is to ensure that the continuity of employment remains. And that's not a matter that is in question for a sole trader. It is very much in question for an employee. If an employee who is a part-timer or a casual, for example, accesses those services, there is a very high risk that at that point the employment relationship ends. And at that point, the employee no longer gets the shifts that they were going to get. They're viewed by their employer because of misunderstanding and lack of communication as being unavailable. And the employment relationship ceases at that point, which is a significant risk factor for that woman in terms of her capacity to respond to and deal with the family and domestic violence that she's experiencing. And so I think it's an important point to keep central is that this is about accessing services. It is also about continuing employment to ensure a person can go on with their lives and successfully live safely.
So if I take your point that sole traders have factored in their other entitlements, then how do you explain then for casual workers who are paid a loading that this isn't considered as part of that?
Sorry, I'll just correct. I didn't suggest that they have factored in, that they do factor in and they can extend factoring in paid family violence leave. Sole traders can do that. Casual workers don't have the same ability to say, well, I'm going to now increase my casual loading to this amount to factor in paid family and domestic violence leave. But if I can come back to the whole point of paid family and domestic violence leave is this is about ensuring that workers have the ability to connect with services without disruption to their income. I'll once again state the point that I made earlier, which is those who are living with violence are often being financially monitored. If the perpetrator is of the view that their partner was going to work, but the partner was actually accessing leave to instead connect with a worker like Sam and her colleagues, to make a safety plan, to access a refuge, to set up a bank account, to seek new accommodation, and those things take time, and the perpetrator looks in the bank account and says, I thought you were at work and the income that I was expecting to see there isn't there, that woman's life is in danger. And that's what is absolutely unacceptable and must be a threshold issue that is delivered by the legislation that's currently being considered. And
we've heard evidence from small businesses that this leave will this provision will disproportionately affect those running small businesses. What can you help the committee with on understanding that issue?
Just to start us off, and then I'll hand over to the ASU. What we know and we hear from small business all the time is that their relationship with their employees is already very personal and intimate, and they already provide these leave entitlements to their employees because they are a small, tight-knit, close community. And that's reflected by the data of enterprise agreements that provide paid family and domestic violence leave. 1/3 of those are enterprise agreements of small businesses. And so the existence of those relationships already and those entitlements already is there. We know that the legislation provides, the proposed legislation, provides an extended period in which business have to prepare and adjust for the access to the entitlement. And then the last point I will make is that the cost benefit analysis is true at every level, macro or micro. If a small business employee is experiencing FDV at the moment, that business is experiencing damage and loss as a result. Lost productivity, the employee's absenteeism, perhaps the employee having to scramble and access other kinds of leaves at very short notice. So the business is experiencing the impact of that FDV already. The cost savings analysis works at an individual level as well as at a large level by providing that employee with the ability for a clear, prearranged period of time to go and get the service support that they need. That will help the business as well as help the employee, in our view. I'll hand over to the ACU if they've got anything to add.
Thanks, Sarah, and I completely agree and echo all of the comments that the ACTU have made there. I'd add as well that there is a disproportionate cost already imposed on small business by not having paid family and domestic violence leave. Where workers become disconnected from their employment, the cost of recruitment, interview, checking referees, onboarding, training, losing an experienced worker who is working at a high capacity, needing to bring in a new worker who doesn't have the same capacity level through experience. Those are absolute costs that are already borne by all businesses, especially small businesses. So I just think it's really important we don't think about this as there is a cost associated with paid family violence leave, but there's a freebie in not having paid family violence leave. I would suggest very strongly that the cost of not having paid family violence leave is far greater.
Good, thank you very much. To Senator Grogan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Now, we've heard a bit already today that the government bill that's been put forward actually departs from the Fair Work Commission's decision in some sort of key aspects, one of which is the issue of casuals. Can you just highlight for us why do casuals need access to this leave, given it's not the normal structure for leave provisions, and how will it actually work in practice for casuals who don't get a written roster?
As I've said, the application of this entitlement as a universal entitlement is crucial. Family and domestic violence is something experienced by all kinds of Australians across all categories of work, but in particular we commend this bill for applying itself to casuals because casual employees are representative of a group who are particularly vulnerable, people who are on lower incomes, people who have less security, and people who are predominantly women. In terms of how the entitlement will actually work where a roster does not exist, it's true that casual engagement is individual and ad hoc, but that does not mean that the arrangement is not made in advance. Casual shifts are not offered and accepted at the time of the shift. You don't accept a 9 o'clock shift at 9 o'clock. Those arrangements are made in advance to ensure that the work gets done. And so the bill proposed provides a very simple and direct way of establishing what the projected roster of a casual employee. It is based on whether the offer of the shift is made and whether that shift is accepted. So whether there is an offer and an acceptance. And this is reflective of industry practice. Across every industry, it is true that the first step is for casuals to be advised that a shift is available. And the second step is for the casual employee to accept that offer of a shift. In some instances, that happens 2 weeks in advance. In some instances, it happens 2 days in advance. But in either occasion, it has to occur. And it's true that it's done over a range of platforms. It can be done via text message, via online apps, via physical site rosters. But again, there is always an exchange where that process occurs, where there is an offer and acceptance. And so we think the bill proposes a very simple and direct way that is reflective of industry practice for how you can calculate what the projected roster of a casual employee would be. But I'll hand over to the ACU if they have anything to add to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I would echo all of the comments by the ACT. I would also add that there's quite a number of undertakings involved in leaving violence that one cannot plan. So if you are waiting for a safe time to be able to leave the home and to make an escape, if there is a time that suddenly the perpetrator's not in the house, you have to seize that moment and be able to take that opportunity to be able to leave the home. So having the provision for casual workers to be able to call up and say, you know, I was expecting this shift. I did take a phone call 3 days ago from my manager who said, you know, blah, 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 suddenly off sick and can you take this shift? I've accepted it, but right now is my window and I can grab that window and leave. Also, we all know the difficulty of being able to access housing. So when suddenly there is a home that becomes available that for rental, you have to take that window to be able to get access, to do the inspection, to fill in the paperwork. So whilst some undertakings are about careful and methodical planning to be able to leave violence, some undertakings are also ad hoc, and when opportunity presents, it has to be taken.
I'd like to add to that, that sometimes a domestic violence incident can occur without warning, suddenly, and if someone is assaulted and the perpetrator leaves and can't be located by police, it's not safe for the family to remain at the home and they might have to relocate to a women's refuge, which might be a fair distance from where they normally live or work, and knowing that they can access immediate leave enables people to do that.
Thank you very much. Senator Little.
Thank you. Thank you for attending today. We know the take-up of small and new businesses owned by women is significant and at record levels. We've heard from business representatives today that it is not the leave that is an issue, it is that they are actually being asked to administer it. And in some cases, many cases, this will put them as first response to an issue of family and domestic violence. Would it not be better for the safety of those people fleeing domestic violence, as well as fellow workers, for this to be administered through an independent system such as the social security system?
No, it would not be better to have it administered through the social security system. I'd like to speak to a couple of points there. First off, it is already a very complex system to navigate in connecting with services and leaving violence. Having to navigate yet another complex system is not going to be in the interest of the woman experiencing family violence. The next is that, as I've mentioned now on a couple of occasions, what is paramount is that there is no disruption to the income in a woman's bank account. So if suddenly your income is paid by Centrelink and not paid by your employer, then that will absolutely present a red flag to the perpetrator of violence and put that woman's life in danger. I'd also make the point that not having paid family and domestic violence leave does not stop disclosures. Those disclosures are still being made in the workplace to employers and they will continue to be made. We can't move to an idea that we're going to have a don't ask, don't tell attitude in workplaces about family and domestic violence. If you're unable to turn up to work because you have been assaulted and you have bruising, we can expect that there will still be disclosures, and that's not going to disappear because the employer has said, I don't want to hear about it, go talk to Centrelink. We already see situations where women are subjected to performance management processes where the performance issues are directly related to the experience of family violence, and those disclosures are already made to the employer, to the union officials. So we can't wish this away. These disclosures will be made. What's far safer for women who are running businesses and who are going to be receiving those disclosures is that they are resourced and supported to be able to respond appropriately. So I'm incredibly excited at the prospect of having a paid leave entitlement. That means when those disclosures will be made, noting they are already being made, that employers will be better equipped to respond in a way that is appropriate and most supportive for the woman making the disclosure, but also for their own safety and well-being. And again, I would point to there are already a number of very excellent resources that are available, and it's wonderful to hear the commitment from the government that in implementing this legislation, further resources will be made available. But please, I cannot emphasise enough that not having a paid family and domestic violence leave entitlement is going to suddenly make workplace disclosures and workplace instances disappear. We've already gone through decades of not having paid family and domestic violence leave entitlements in workplaces. Disclosures were made. And I think it's a very worrying dialogue to move to, where we start saying domestic violence can go back into the home and be a personal matter that we don't talk about. It is the very fact that we have brought the best form of disinfectant, which is sunlight, to the scourge of family violence, and we are talking about it in all social settings. Now we have the opportunity to do so in a supportive, safe way for everyone who's involved in that conversation, the employee making the disclosure, but also the manager or the business owner who is receiving that disclosure, who will now be best equipped to make an appropriate part of the referral pathway and receive that disclosure safely for themselves.
Let me just be clear. I'm not suggesting that there's no involvement of an employer in this scenario that I presented, but it's the administration of it. Thank you.
And if I can supplement what the ASU has said, it is counterproductive that the kinds of things women need this leave to access is time to deal with government processes such as Centrelink. And so it becomes a catch-22 where to access the leave she needs to use to then navigate the complex systems. She has to navigate the complex systems. She is stuck effectively in a web of not having the time and space to properly equip herself to leave the violent situation.
Good, thank you very much, and thank you for your evidence today. If you've taken any questions on notice, if you could reply by the 25th of August, and your evidence will be of a great deal of assistance to the committee in its deliberations for its final report. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, committee.